My name's Henry Dimbleby. This is Andy.
Hi.
He was complaining about the size of the crowd. He's used to bigger. There you go. It's a bit nerve-wracking for me. So the brief for today was to talk about whether regenerative could scale, could become mainstream. And I mean, I come at that from a technical point of view, from a kind of structural systems, what does government have to do point of view. Andy is an entrepreneur trying to make it happen. We are very aware that our knowledge is quite limited compared to the sum of knowledge in this room. So what we thought we would do is I would just talk a little bit about the kind of framework and what support the next government, of whatever colour it is, might give. I'm then going to talk to Andy about what it's like starting from one field in France to get where he's got to now, and then what does he see for Wildfarmed the next 20 years being like. Is it 20 years or is that too long for you, Andy?
Too long.
Too long. 5 years. 5 years and out. And then we're going to go to the Magic Teapot, where I'm going to be signing books, and Andy will be signing chests of men or women, or there'll be or whatever. We're allowed to say that we're not in London anymore, so we're allowed to do it. Andy will be doing the Andy thing, and I'll sign 2 books and look sheepish. My name's Henry Dimbleby. I founded the Leon restaurant chain. I then worked with government to create the National Food Strategy, which I turned into the book Ravenous with my wife, because she told me that no one was ever going to read a government food strategy. We wrote it for our 16-year-old son in the belief that if you can't explain something to a 16-year-old, you don't understand it yourself. I'm now setting up Bramble, which is a business to invest in and advise sustainable food businesses. Broadly speaking, the National Food Strategy, as it sits now, the Tory government actually, secretly, quietly, has done or is doing most of, or was doing most of the environmental stuff, and they've done nothing on health. It started, really, we started looking back and saying, how do we get to where we are? How do we get to a food system that was one of the most ingenious, innovative sectors of the economy, and yet was so destructive, both to human health and to planetary health? And I think it's always good reminding yourself that the food system is in many ways a miracle. Up until the end of the Second World War, we basically, in order to produce more food, we dug up more land. That was the way. As the human race expanded, we dug up more soil, we planted more food. This chart shows 3 lines. The red one is number of calories, the black one is the population, the green one is the amount of land that we farmed. And until the late 19th century, basically, the 3 were the same thing. After the Second World War, 2.8 billion people on the planet. Scientists thought that because of improvements in sanitation and medication, the population would explode to over 8 billion, and there was going to be no land left. You look at the books and the newspapers of the late 40s and early 50s, and they are full of stories of Malthusian collapse, that the next 50 years of human life would be marked by not having enough food to feed humans, which would lead to starvation, which would lead to wars of scarce resource, which would lead to mass migration. That didn't happen because of the Green Revolution, that everyone here, or many people here, will see as one of the great harmful acts of human innovation, this combining of mined, industrial, produced fertilizer using the Haber-Bosch process with modern, tall, high-yielding forms of wheat, and then rice, and then maize, and modern forms of agriculture, which enables us today to produce twice the number of calories per person on the planet for 8 billion people off slightly less land than we produced for 2.8 billion people back in 1945. It is, by any means, a huge feat of innovation. And we didn't have that starvation. But it caused huge problems. And as everyone in this tent will know, I mean, I see basically the food transition as being second only to the energy and transport transition. And it's only just being talked about. But the food system is the biggest cause of biodiversity collapse by far. It's the biggest cause of freshwater stress. It's the biggest cause of freshwater pollution, deforestation, soil degradation, the collapse of aquatic life. It is a disaster, and it is also the biggest cause of avoidable ill health. It costs our country about £100 billion a year, almost as much as we spend on food, in cost to the NHS and lack of productivity. It is a disaster. One way of looking at that is to look at 10,000 BC, a period where all farming was regenerative. It was the beginning of agriculture. It was the period of stable climate where we could plan the seasons, so we could farm. There were 2.5 million people on the planet, dwarfed by the number of wild animals. Look at that today, and you see the people have increased to 8 billion, but the biggest, most successful species, if you don't think about the conditions they live in, are the animals that we rear to eat. They weigh twice as much at any one time as all of the humans on the planet, 20 times as much as all of the wild animals. Very few of these creatures are used in regenerative rotations. So to say that we have to, it is possible, and I'm going to say this as I said again, it is possible for both things to be true, that we need to reduce the amount of meat we eat, and we need to increase the amount of meat we use to restore soil. But this system is a disaster. So what do you do? How do you solve it? Fundamentally, we identified that there were two things going wrong, and both needed to be fixed by government. The first was, on the nature side, that not only was nature invisible in the systems that we use to measure success, it's not in your wallet, it's not in the balance sheet of companies, it's not in the way we measure GDP. We are actually paying $500 billion a year globally in subsidies to industrial agriculture, to fishing, and to fossil fuel companies to destroy nature. So we shouldn't be surprised that we're destroying it at such a rate. And the most frightening thing that we saw through this whole piece was this chart, which was, it isn't only nature that food is destroying, it's the second biggest cause of climate change, 20 to 30% of emissions. This is what yields are projected to look like in a 2.5 to 3 degree climate change scenario. And what you see here has echoes for me of 1945. So you see that we think, this is NASA and the UN, that yields of wheat in the northern hemisphere will increase. Wheat, notwithstanding the fact that a lot of wheat didn't go into the ground this winter, you know, wheat doesn't like floods, but wheat does like warm weather, water, and carbon dioxide. And the thinking is that, on average, wheat yields will increase, but maize and rice yields in the southern hemisphere and the equatorial zones will decrease. And this looks to me, when I look at it, like that situation they were worried about back in 45. It looks like lack of food in certain parts of the world, wars of scarce resource, mass migration. So what do we do about it? We argued that government needed to be much more thoughtful about how we use our land. So that basically we had an equation where we used our land fundamentally previously for farming using fossil fuels, so mining fossil fuels to increase yields on farmland. We now need to use our land for farming, to restore nature, to sequester carbon. And that requires much more thoughtful use of our land. We currently farm 18 million hectares in this country. About the same, the hexagons on the right-hand side are also acres abroad that feed us. And 85% of those acres in the UK are used either to graze animals or to produce food to feed to animals. And so we argued that the common agricultural policy, the subsidies and the regulation needed to shift farming away from this mining, this destructive operation, to one that restores nature. And we saw basically a spectrum that exists at this festival, which is at one end, people trying to maintain yields but reduce inputs systemically, often using regenerative techniques, but also using biological replacements for fossil fuel pesticides and herbicides, but trying to maintain yields. And at the other end, people intentionally bringing nature back onto land. And that you need those two things. You need that spectrum, because there are whole ecosystems that live on farmland. We farmed for 12,000 years. You can't just have sustainable intensification and wild farming. You need the kind of farming that people at this festival want to produce. And that is what the Future Farming Framework is trying to do. That is what DEFRA have been edging towards. There's another problem which I won't talk about today, which we call the junk food cycle. And this is simply the fact that our food is killing us. The Treasury are now the most worried government department about this because they've realized that 3 million people out of work, primarily there due to the diet they eat. And the incentives for food companies, because we have this ancient evolved appetite, are to spend more and more money marketing and developing the foods that we instinctively eat. 85% of the foods sold by the big FMCG companies are deemed too unfit, too unhealthy to market to children. This will either be broken by government intervention, it might also be broken by drugs. So there's quite a large chance, I think, and in America they're terrified of it, that Nestle will literally lose profit to the drugs companies. So rather than eating the Mars bars, we will be taking appetite-suppressing drugs. Not a particularly rosy future. I'm not going to talk about that today, but I have a lot to say about it if you want to meet me in the bar later on. So, so finally, before I get on to Andy, what do I think is going to happen? So assuming we get a Labour government, I think there is both good news and slight concern. So the good news is, it is very clear that Wes Streeting, who will be our health secretary, that Dan Zeitner, who will be our Minister for Food if things pan out, who's followed this area incredibly closely, and that Steve Reed, all saying publicly they want to push forward with this work. So they want to continue the work. The jeopardy is that they haven't put any of it in their manifesto. So the one thing they have put in their manifesto is that they'll do a land use framework. That land use framework will inevitably say we need more regenerative farming, we need more nature-friendly farming. But in order to avoid being attacked, they haven't been specific about other things. And if you're hopeful, you think, well, they'll just get on and do it. But it also means that if they want to be bold, they don't have they'll have a huge majority, but they won't have a manifesto that enables them to be bold. So they could be picked up. So I think it's going to be a fascinating 5 years ahead. I think the biggest fight will come in the NHS. I predict in 2 years there'll be a massive fight between the left of the Labour Party and Wes Streeting about the reforms of the NHS. That's enough about boring politics. Now let's talk to the pop star. So Andy, if I remember rightly, I first met you or came across you because you were trying to get some seed. I was the lead non-exec at DEFRA.
Yeah.
You were trying to get some seed from France into the UK that we weren't allowing you to import. But
maybe we shouldn't be talking about that at the minute.
No, they let you, I think.
Yeah.
They let you. But just you started off with one field in France. How did that happen, and when did it strike you that you might need a bigger farm?
Well, I mean, it started with an article, Power of Journalism. It was an article that I read on the way back from a gig. It talked about the environmental consequences of food production. It had this line in it: if you don't like the system, don't depend on it. And that inspired me from a sort of standing start in my mid-30s to try growing some vegetables. But the books that I was reading at the beginning were the antithesis of all of this. It was like John Seymour's Guide to Self-Sufficiency. There was a book called 5 Acres of Independence. I can't remember who wrote that one. It was like Walden, a Thoreau book, so all about kind of withdrawal from the world and trying to be self-sufficient. And then I guess it was like an understanding of the processes at work, of fascination with seeing plants grow and become food, and the interaction with disorder between plants and stuff, combined with living in a part of France where it was brutal. You know, like seeing farmers moving irrigation sprinklers all night long for months, being pushed to grow feed maize year after year after year. Or these heavy clays being reduced to a kind of jaundiced yellow, farmers hanging on by a thread. And so it was a combination, I think, of just seeing that something had to be done and wanting to join the movement of people trying, and sort of naivety and fascination, a lot of naivety from my vegetable experience that led me to sell my publishing rights and go all in.
But when you bought a farm, this was going to be like a hobby project. You were going to see if you could do it on one farm, or did you already have ambition that you might be able to do something bigger, or was it just?
Oh, no. It was just like I wanted to be a farmer for the rest of my life. That was it. That's what I wanted to do. Right. So it didn't. There was no ambition beyond trying to make that work. And in the first few years of doing that, it didn't work at all. I mean, it was a total disaster.
Because you didn't know what you were doing.
I didn't know what I was doing. It was a very humbling lesson in all the skills you need to be a farmer. I didn't have them. They came slowly. I was farming on very degraded soils. I was adopting kind of what were then quite niche technologies like inter-row hose guided by cameras or GPS on the tractors, which were one, quite early, and two, in an area where there was no support. So I'd be kind of a memorable moment going round and round in circles in a GPS tractor that just wouldn't stop.
Captured, taken hostage.
So they were brutal 3 or 4 years, and actually an experience that's never left me. Just how I was lucky, like I could go and play records and not go broke. It was exhausting, but I knew that I could survive. But it's never left me as a lesson in kind of just how lonely and how incredibly difficult it is to produce food year after year.
And what was the turning point? When do you think, well, actually, I might be able to make this work?
Well, the irony is in sort of connected world, because I've been lucky enough to spend a bit of time with John Kemp over the past couple of days. And when I bought the farm was when he had his powdery mildew moment. I don't know if people, and everyone here has heard his story, but on their vegetable farm, and they took on some old pasture land, and then they planted across the slope. So some of the, I think it was melons, if I remember rightly. Some of the melons are in their field that have been very intensively cultivated and lots of pesticides and so on, and half of the melons were in the old pasture field, and the powdery mildew disease just stopped on that line where the melons were planted in this pasture. And that was happening, I now realize, the same year that I was buying my farm, and how much heartache and money and time and effort it would have solved, or saved rather, if I'd found out about people like him earlier on. But I didn't. I came across a book by Albert Howard, An Agricultural Testament, his basic message about diversity and nature working through putting lots of different plants together in the same place at the same time, and these biological systems. And I decided, based on that, to try.
And this was how many years in?
3 or 4. Yeah.
And then how many years did it take you before you thought, well, actually, I've got something here that's interesting?
Yeah, well, I mean, that probably took about another 5, because there was a whole diversion.
So how are you about 15 when you sold your recording rights?
All straw farming. So by about sort of 2019, I'd come up with this pasture cropping plan. So there'd been a long road, like introducing livestock. That was a lesson in itself. Introducing herbal lays, mob grazing. I'd done some crimper rolling, mulching cover crops. I'd done some frost-sensitive cover crops. Tried all of these things, but it was the soil recovery where the pasture was that really was standing out. And so I wanted to try avoiding ploughing that. And I thought, well, what about planting cereals into that? And then the idea of mowing between them, so these kind of lethal prototypes that were developed. And I thought that when I got somewhere with that, I thought that this was the thing. So we ended up with a farm, shop and bakery based around that essential farming idea. But then, of course, I think is it George Bernard Shaw who says you can't change anything if you can't change your mind. And it's just a constancy of new information and learning. And
when you say was it, who was it just you? Like who was helping you through this? And
it was an amazing Belgian called Thierry. And
right.
He was a guy who came to help in the vegetable patch originally, or the vegetable market garden, because he wanted to have money to do his passion of horses and horse whispering. And that's why we ended up farming with horses, because I'd never ridden a horse in my life. So it was thanks to him that we could do all of that stuff. So it was me and Thierry. It was quite a pair.
So this is 2019. You've got your farm working now. You've got your farm shop and your bakery. Occasionally you go off and do gigs and meet famous people. That all sounds quite nice.
Yeah.
What went wrong?
I met Ed and George. And so we ended up in a situation where we had this lovely field to plate community. We were baking bread for schools, and it was really, really nice. And basically the power of that collaboration, like consumers being able to use their food choices to support the kind of farming, or maybe because they like the taste of it, or whatever people's reasons are. It's important to say, I think, that is not an affluent area of France by any means. And so people were nevertheless paying a bit more because they liked what we were doing and then allowed us to do what we were doing. And so when I met Ed and George, the thinking was, well, hang on, we haven't got much ecological road left, all the things that you've just been talking about. How do we do this at scale? How can we create this sort of field to plate community for high street shoppers? And it seemed quite simple until we tried.
So they said, come on, you've got to do this. You've got to make this bigger. This is too good just to sit on it.
Yeah, let's try.
Because you were just thinking of sending the farm. Remember, there was a point where you were thinking of sending the wheat from France to a few bakeries in East End London and doing...
Yeah, we started with, we thought we were originally going to supply bakeries with mills, and we were going to do fresh flour. I mean, the whole thing has evolved so much.
And so talk us through then how it went from that conversation with Ed and George to where you are today, and what where you are today looks like.
Try and do that in a few minutes because it's a bit of a long story, but I suppose in terms of farming, there was a realization with the pasture cropping when I started trying to do that in grassy pastures, it didn't work. And by this time, I'd invested everything on this sort of pasture cropping idea and developed it and developed it and developed it. And then it was a real
And the details of this pasture cropping, just because you've explained it to me before, but it's like exactly how did it work?
So then I did like, different iterations, but where I ended up was you have a permanent pasture, you open up a slit one way or another, you plant your crop into it, and then you manage the grass initially by grazing, and then later in the season with a mower that goes between the rows. And so that had been really promising in France, and when I started doing it in grassy pastures in the UK, it just wasn't working very well at all. And it was about that time that I came across Dr. Christine Jones, more the John Kemp and the Gabe Browns, all these other sort of inputs coming in, and kind of realized that the reason why the soil and the pasture have been coming back quicker in France compared to my crimper rolled vetch or whatever was because of plant diversity. I just thought it was because it was perennial rather than annual. But then I really started to understand this plant diversity thing. And so we decided to build the Wildfarmed farming community around this idea of diversity through companion cropping, cover cropping. And so we started building the farming community, and then it became clear that if you're saying to people, can you pay a bit more for this flour because it's coming from farmers who are companion cropping, they're using massively reduced inputs and so on, people say, well, what am I buying? And that led us to drawing up the Wildfarmed standards to say, okay, this is what we're doing. When we drew those up, outcome monitoring, which we spend a lot of our time doing today, was really in its infancy. I mean, it's amazing how much that's come on just in the last 3 years. So we thought, well, while we can't wait around 10 years waiting to decide on how we're going to measure outcomes, let's define some processes which we know will lead to good outcomes. So cover cropping, reduced inputs, and so on and so forth, companion cropping. So we drew those up, built a community around that, and then on the other end of it started these kind of concentric circles of these amazing artisan bakers who supported us in the beginning, and then moving out from that, the kind of people who were watching those, people like, Franco Manca, and then Ask Pizza, and then eventually, our internal phrase was the long road to Greg's. We ended up working with supermarkets and about 110 farmers.
But take me back to that building the farmer community, because I think as someone who's opened restaurants, it's quite easy, you raise some money, you open a restaurant, it's not successful for a long time, you manage to make enough money that you open another one, and then you open another one. That's quite easy to imagine, but you've got a farm in France, and then you come to the UK and you build a farmer community and sell. I mean, literally, how does that work? You go and knock on the doors of farms?
Literally that, to start with. So I was lucky to get the lease of a National Trust farm. So I started farming in the UK, knocked on doors, spent a lot of time in a very small red Suzuki, and driving around doing that and meeting some really people who were just incredibly supportive, and people like John Palsy was one of the first people, Helen Browning, Sam Phillips, who's just up the road from me, lots of amazing people who we were saying, look, we want to re-engage high street shoppers with where their food comes from and build this field to plate community around these certain farming principles, try and find the sweet spot where biology rather than chemistry can be the driver of production, but it can be scalable and all these things. And people, it resonated with people, and then we got to a point where we were having open days at my farm, which was just horrifically stressful because I was just trying to get on top of things. Nothing was how I wanted it to look. I thought it was a bit of a shit show, to be honest. And there was this meeting of farmers in the car park afterwards. And again, John Palsy gave this amazing speech just basically saying, I think it looks great. Thanks for trying. Thanks for trying to build a community. It's been really lonely, and this is a really nice thing. And that will never leave me at that moment.
And so how many, at that stage, over the year, how many were there to begin with, and how many are there now?
I can't remember the exact chronology. I guess there's probably about 20 or 30 or something, but it's moved quite quickly, and we've got a lot of farmers now who want to join us, so it's exciting. And I think that sense of being part of a community, being able to eat what you've grown, and our farming team, Harriet, Charlie, Nick, and others, they surround our farmers with so much effort goes into trying to help people and support people with open days and webinars and agronomy and all these things.
And you've got the principles, but presumably what works differs depending on where people are in the country, what their soil's like. Do you have people applying the principles in quite different ways in different parts of the country or on different soils, or is it all? If I go to a wildfowl farm, I'll see strips of this size, and it'll.
No, we're not doing that. So just to be clear, so we moved away from the pasture crop. Some farms are doing it. Some farmers have inter-row mowers. There's a new version of the inter-row mower is on Trevor Tappin's stand here, which I recommend people having a look at. That's great. What we're trying to do is keep it simple. And so what a lot of our growers do is just combine two crops in the same seed drill, put it in the same field. And so actually the field scale implementation of that technically it's not complicated, but don't underestimate the mindset change in there, because by putting 2 plants in the same field, by managing without pesticides from the moment the seed is planted until it's harvested, you're essentially moving from a mindset of sort of control and to a degree suppression of natural systems to nurturing and collaborating natural systems with natural systems. That's a massive shift, even if planting the 2 things is relatively straightforward. The logistical complications are for us afterwards, like separating that out, you know, how you store it, move it around successfully, and all those kind of things.
And, you know, if there are farmers in here who are here, and there are twice as many people here, I think, there were last year. I imagine there are quite a few regen curious people. What are the things, like, for you, what were and for the farmers that come on board, they're nervous, what are the biggest challenges? What are kind of biggest risks, challenges that they have to overcome?
Well, I think there's lots of bits to this. I mean, the most successful piece of technology that we've had in Wildfarmed is the WhatsApp group, and like real-time knowledge sharing. And
I've tried to break into that group on many occasions.
No chance.
Ed has repelled me viciously.
Absolutely no chance. Well defended. But that's been a fantastic tool, you know. So I think that community support is a really, really important thing. Trying to stabilize prices, so to reduce the perception of risk, allowing people to have a try on a smaller area of land, looking at comparisons with conventional margins as opposed to Wildfarmed or other system margins, but also looking at it in terms of return of investment. So for sure, like if the wheat price is quite high and the nitrogen price is low again, if all the ducks line up, you will make more money on your conventional field, almost certainly. But if you look at the return on investment, you might get £2.50 back for every £1 you spend. And in a different kind of system, you might get £4 or £5 back for every £1 you spend. And when we're dealing with the kind of wild weather we're dealing with now, that's not insignificant. Yeah, so
I mean, I've heard repeatedly from farmers who've improved their soils that they got much more wheat in this year, spring crop in, than anyone else in the flooded fields because they didn't have water on the surface. Is that something your farmers experience too?
Well, I think it's too early some of our farmers have been doing very different things for a very long time, so it's too early for the relationship with us as Wildfarmed to say this has been transformed into that, you know. But I think we all know that a carbon sponge is the key, you know, to be able to weather what is increasingly becoming a wet season and a dry season. You know, if you want to be able to infiltrate and percolate water, we've got to get some soil structure and some carbon back.
So you won't let us into that WhatsApp group unless we join. How much of my garden do I need to wild farm before I'm allowed in the?
As long as you can fill a grain lorry.
But tell us what the things that they talk about. Like, what are the biggest topics of conversation that happen between the farmers in that group?
Oh, it's highly seasonal. I mean, as you'd expect. So when it's drilling, it's like, you know, percentage of beans to wheat or barley to pea or whatever. Recently, it's been rust. Everyone's been talking about rust. Or it could be, you know, mechanical options for weed management, or it could be, you know, varietal differences, or I mean, it just goes on and on and on. But it's an absolute hive brain, and we're actually, they're all we, but Paula, Harriet, and Charlie are working on how we can take what's been exchanged in that already and kind of put it under a reference system, because there's so much gold information.
Yeah. Fun enough, we've got, for the charity I set up, Chefs in Schools, we have a chef's WhatsApp group where they talk about how do you make different food, what oven do you have, how do I make, you know, if I let you into that, can I?
We'll talk about that after.
Okay, so that's where you are today. There are 36 million hectares of land. A lot that's pasture, but there's a lot of arable that feeds the UK. For us to achieve our nature goals and our carbon goals and produce nutritious food, we need regenerative agriculture to scale. Like, otherwise, we're just all here, and Groundswell will be something that was nice, but then the planet died. Yeah. So I mean, there are 2 routes to scale, right? So you either pay a bit more, yeah, or you make customers pay a bit more. You find a way to do that, or governments build in the costs of the harm into the conventional systems, and so you can compete with other wheats on cost.
Yeah.
Which of those 2 routes do you think are kind of, how are you thinking about your scaling, and which of those 2 routes you follow, and how you strategize around that?
there's two different bits of cost. You know, I think in our experience, so we've recently, up until now, we've been a sort of business-to-business model, selling flour to people or pizza balls or whatever. And recently we've had bread in Waitrose. This is our beginning of our direct-to-customer experience. And I think there's two elements to cost. I think there is a legitimate conversation which says, you know, going back to my experiences in France, these were not affluent people coming buying bread from me. They were people who wanted to use their food choices to make a difference, and within the constraints of their budget, that was possible. So in London, at least, it's £7 for a pint, it's £3.80 for a latte, it's £1 for a loaf of bread. So, you know, that's a conversation that needs to be had. That what value we attributing to what type of food and drink. There also, I think, needs to be a reassessment of what cost and value is. You know, so we're hopefully going to partner with Deloitte to do a true cost of food analysis of UK cereals, because that's been done elsewhere, I think, for coffee and other things. Because, you know, we know that if you factored in the externalized costs, both negative and positive, of different systems, then the actual cost on the shelf would be the same or cheaper of food from these kind of farming systems. And really, I think that, you know, we're doing all kinds of output measuring to sort of prove that arable or food-producing landscape can be nature-rich and contribute to water quality and all this stuff. And we'll get there, but we could really do with government helping while we're on the road to doing that.
And what would be, so, you know, Elms, I think, is very interesting. I think the team at DEFRA, led by Janet Hughes, are an extraordinary, powerful team, and they've shifted things, and they've underpaid for things, and they've moved, and they probably, in my view, slightly overpaying on GS4, on species-rich grassland, £600 per hectare. We're going to have a lot of species-rich grassland. Maybe we need a bit more food. But what for your farmers, regenerative farmers, what are the payments that they currently can get from DEFRA or elsewhere? And is there anything that would just suddenly, you know, set the system on fire and make it possible for this to scale?
Yeah, well, I think because also when we're talking about scaling, with that, what we need to say, what is it that we're trying to scale? So, and not everyone's going to see this as the same solution, you know. So what we're looking at from a wild farm perspective, what the outcomes that we want are good farmer outcomes, nature-rich landscapes or nature-rich food-producing landscapes, nutrient-dense food. So, but people will have different versions of their thing, you know, and we're all going to sort of push together in the same direction. So from what we're trying to achieve specifically, I was saying the other day, I think Janet Hughes and John Place, and someone else I'm sure you know at DEFRA, I think that they, you know, the knife scene in Psycho, I think that must be the ringtone they've assigned to me. Because I've been on at them and on at them. So to be fair, they've updated AB 14 so that it can go after beans, it can go after rape, which is what we were asking. It can be used for bicrops, which is also what we were asking. It's a bit of a round peg in a square hole, because the outcomes of that are not really what we're trying to do, which is biodiversity-rich food-producing landscapes. But nevertheless, it's a great start. The one thing for us that could really transform it is what I said a little while ago, is we've got this long shadow, which probably goes back to Descartes and all of our kind of separation from the natural world. But like on any given field, it's either nature or food. And can we just back people who want to do both in the same place at the same time? You know, so alongside biodiversity net gain, which only applies to non-productive landscapes, let's have a food and nature net gain. Yep. And if we did that, it's an absolute game changer.
Fantastic. I'm going to come to think of your questions. There are two people with microphones. Can you hold up the microphones, people with microphones? There's one there and one somewhere else. I'll stand up to see them. Anyway, find the mic. I'm just going to, while the mic's finding the people, put up your hand. Mike will come to you. There's one there. 20 years' time, you will be 10 years retired. George, who's only about 16, will still have lots of hair and be running Wildfarmed.
Yeah.
What will Wildfarmed look like then, and what system will it live inside?
I don't know the answer to that question, obviously, but I do know that, because what we're doing is incredibly difficult, and we're trying really hard to do it, but it's not easy. So I don't know what the outcome of that will be. What I do know is that in 20 years' time, we could be having farmers who are getting fair returns for not just for the quality of their food, but for the quality of the ecosystems they're growing it in. We could have fields that are still full of healthy crops despite the wild differences in rainfall, because the soil can infiltrate and percolate water. We could have the brightest young minds coming into food and farming because it's cool and because it's aspirational. We could have NHS waiting lists coming down because we're talking about food as medicine. We could have reports in the paper about species diversity going up and up every year. We could do all of those things. We've got everything that we know, everything that we need now to do those things. It's just whether we all choose to do it.
Fantastic. Andy, thank you very much. Right. How many, do we have 2 microphones or 3? 3. So I'm going to take 3 questions at a time, 1 from each mic, and then Andy, you're going to have to remember the 3 questions.
Can you do that?
I'll remember them, and I'll put them to you. So I've got 1 here.
Hi, I'm Dr. Vanessa Kimball. My specialism is the impact of bread on the gut microbiome and mental health. And first of all, I want to say a huge congratulations to Andy and Wildfarmed. What you're doing is amazing.
Oh, thank you.
And my work particularly looks at the impact on bread on human health. And I just want to ask a couple of quick questions, because for me, the bran and the fibre is everything. It nourishes the gut, and our little Oompa Loompas make our neurochemicals with it. So when I munch on a wild-farmed whole grain loaf, my microbes are making serotonin, you know, the happy hormone, dopamine, reward, really important for me. I'm neurodiverse. And really importantly for me right now, I was really wishing that I've got some GABA-aminobutyrate, which is GABA. It calms your anxiety down.
Know the feeling.
This is quite nerve-wracking asking a question.
Imagine standing up here.
Yeah. I'm coming to you next, Henry. Right, so bran and fibre and diversity in our food lowers inflammation. So when you grow your wheat, there are very few chemicals that get on there, right? So you haven't got the glyphosate at very low levels, if at all, low levels of fungicides, low levels of pesticides. Is that right?
Well, there's no pesticides applied to the growing crop.
Right, so that's fantastic news for the gut microbiome. And then that fibre helps slow blood sugar. It's shown to prevent cancer. It's shown to prevent cardiovascular disease. It helps with weight management, always a plus for me.
Question?
My question is, you've got white
bread, you bastard. Okay, right bread. I knew that question was coming.
Right, okay. And, no, we've got another one.
Oh, we've got another one. And something else. I knew there was a but.
Monoculture. We've been working together for a long, long time on getting and milling the whole meadow, a meadow blend, getting diversity. You can turn around behind you and we could pick some of those and put it in the flour. And
So the second one, sorry, what's the second
diversity. It's a meadow blend. We mill the whole meadow and we put every...
the question is, why isn't he using it?
So the question is, what happens to the bran that would have gone into the white bread? Where's it gone, please, Andy?
Okay.
Because that's the bit I'm excited about. Where did it go?
I will ask the question. And then there's a question over here. If we could keep the question a little shorter, that would be great. No, that was great. I agree with everything you say.
Hi, I'm Saffron Johnston from Baker Consultants. We're ecologists. How do you monitor that what you're doing is better for the land and better for the soil?
Okay, how do you actually prove that it's the case? How do you monitor it? And then there's someone else with a microphone. There's someone else with a microphone here.
I'm David Hill I'm an estate manager in Berkshire. My question's around cost and externalities. We're talking about how we make this work and the externalities having to effectively increase the cost of conventional food to get to the price point that you're producing at. How, with a government that recognises cost rather than value, how do we persuade them to transfer some of that value out of health service, as you've said, and the costs of everything that goes with our food system? How do we get them to compete that with the pressure of the food conglomerates who have got clearly so much power in government?
Okay, I might take that question.
Yeah.
So Andy, white bread, you bastard, what do you do with the bran? Can we have it?
Yes.
Answer that one first.
Yeah, okay. Well, I don't know what happens to the bran, is the honest answer. But I think that there's a potentially more important point in that, which is that what we're trying to do is meet the world as it is. So when we did a survey of how many people eat sourdough, it was 76% of people don't. So do we then engage with 24%? or do we meet the world as it is and try and bring the message, the basic message to a society which is completely divorced from its food supply, of you can go into the supermarket and you can buy food from farmers who are doing this, and you can join this collaboration for change. And we choose progress over perfection. Now, you know as well as I do that we're desperate to make these more complex, wholemeal, diverse products, and we've got all kinds of things in progress to try and make that happen. But let's not underestimate, from building a farming community, open days, webinars, agronomy support, persuading plant bakeries that are on wafer-thin margins, doing super high volumes, to abandon the Chorleywood process and do an overnight fermentation, to persuade packaging companies to do what is a totally inconsequential run of bags, to find a supermarket as supportive as Waitrose, to put this on the shelf, the first change in the bread aisle for 125 years. It is so complicated to do what we've done, and such a tribute to our team who've pulled that off. So I think progress over perfection is...
So we came across this problem a lot, and fundamentally, if all Dunkin' Donuts were made with nature-friendly flour, you would solve a big environmental problem and still be making people sick. And that's, in my view, that's progress. So, you know...
But that doesn't discount anything that Vanessa's saying.
There's another fight. There's a junk food cycle fight to be fought, but it's a different fight.
And then we will get there with it.
Is it bullshit, or do you actually measure the results, was the second question.
Okay. So, as I said at the beginning, so when we started, we drew up the standards. It was all about measuring outcomes seemed to be a very long way off. It's coming really, really quickly. So at the moment, we're measuring, I think it's about 1,000 hectares with AgriCarbon and Trinity AgTech for actual boots on the ground, soil measurements. We've got trials en route as we speak with Bristol University and soil acoustics about the biodiversity change in wild farm fields compared to conventional fields. We're doing the carbon reporting via food steps, and with Land Bank, we're trying to take all of that information and turn this into some kind of tradable token, because if we can do that, that's another, in terms of private finance, that's an absolute game changer. So yes, we spend an awful lot of time and effort trying to measure with anyone who's best in class, because we're not just saying, there's a lot of modeling that's going on at satellite level, but we're saying if a farmer chooses to, instead of growing conventional milling wheat, to grow wild-farmed wheat, what's the difference between that field and that field? And the only way we can say that is boots on the ground testing.
Great. And then the question on how do you shift the system? So it is much cheaper to make food in a destructive way, and you make much more money making food that is harmful to people's health. Funny enough, I've been interviewing for something we're publishing in October, all of the prime ministers and the Secretary of State for Health, with the exception of Liz Truss. We asked, but she said no. She sent me a signed copy of her book, which is very nice. And I looked myself up in the index, and there was one very rude sentence about me. And I was like, well, I'm a footnote in the worst political biography ever. Claim to fame. So I think, interestingly, those conversations have confirmed my view that it is much more subtle than just lobbying. So there is lobbying. So, for example, the first meeting that I was asked to hold when I was Secretary of State at DEFRA was with ITV, who were arguing that if you banned children's junk food advertising before the watershed, you wouldn't have any more children's programs made. This was going to be a disaster for et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And luckily, there were a lot of people in advertising who were prepared to stand up and say that wasn't true. So there is lobbying that goes on, but there's things that are much more complicated. One is it requires intervention across government, and so you have to have a strong prime minister, you have to have government departments acting in concert to make change. And then for a lot of these things, there is very little political upside. So you have to have a politician that there's not much political downside. We're not as anti-nanny state, for example, as a country people think, but you have to have a politician that really wants change. So if you look at the future farming program that we have, which is, you know, it's in fits and starts, it's good and bad, but we have an intellectual framework that is ahead of any other country in the world on this. And that's simply because Michael Gove went into DEFRA and decided he wanted to do that. He didn't get there was no political benefit to the Tories from doing that. So the combination of politicians being politicians, multiple departments, no particular political upside, a bit of pull from lobbying, all leads to requiring really strong politicians to push things forward. So that's kind of, I think it's more complicated than just lobbying, it's power, and the power is in favour of the status quo. 3 more questions, one from here.
Thank you. Yes, Chris Evans from the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology. This is just an excuse to stand up, actually, because it's very uncomfortable.
Have a shake.
Yeah, do that. That was inspiring, but also your 1945 map of the world, you know, that future map of the world, that's pretty scary stuff. That, you know, we're in a situation where the developed world might be able to feed itself fine, but the global south is in serious trouble. How do you, can you extrapolate and take all of these concepts in this room and that you're doing and fix that? Because that's a big challenge, and these guys don't have much wiggle room in terms of paying for quality.
So what do you do in the global south? Can you do this in the global south, or do you need to do something else? The second question is, with the mic here.
Andy and Henry, thank you for that. Paul Barnes, South Ormsby Estate up on Lincolnshire Wolds. Andy, I get where you're coming from, because we're doing the same, this food triangle. We're the producer to the miller to the bakehouse to create this South Ormsby sourdough. You've got the drive behind you, Andy, Cato. How do we, as a small scale, fit into this system so we can create this local diverse food chain that we're all after? We know where it's coming from. Henry, second question to you, if I may. Nestle last year released that they was going to do 50% of their produce from regenerative farms. Is there going to be an element where we as organic farmers have certification and is setting standards for Wildfarmed? Do you think there'll be something coming across for regenerative certifications and making sure that us as farmers, organic, regenerative, conventional, are ticking these boxes so we have a better outcome for our marketplace and our food?
Okay, and then the third question is...
Hi, Henry. Ben Reynolds from the Institute for European Environmental Policy in the UK. So you worked on the National Food Strategy a few years back. I was wondering, since writing, what's the policy recommendation that you wish that you'd included, that you would put to the new government? B, that you think would help farms like Andy? And C, what Andy thinks of those policy recommendations?
That is a meta question that is frying my brain. So I'm going to come to the other two first. So the first one is the global south. I've got a little bit to say about the global south. Do you have views?
One thing only.
You go first.
And this is all thanks to John Medley, who's here somewhere, Pasture for Life, who was telling me about Andhra Pradesh, which is an Indian state which has got the same cultivable area as England. I think that's right. And there's a real macro shift happening in a very different way. In other words, much more labour intensive, but away from sort of green revolution towards all the same principles that we've been talking about, where they've got, I think it's a 50% increase in profit, mainly because of the inputs going down, despite labour going up. And so I think those models which allow that profitability to be combined with these sort of principles, and also that's a great situation where you can also get more people back on the land. There's a phrase that John Kemp uses a lot, which is the capacity for stewardship. We need people in the land who really care for it and can steward it. And so that's the only anecdote that I've got, but it feels like a really hopeful one. And that is the size of England, so it's not inconsequential. So I had always thought that I've always said global south's a different thing. I think the food strategy works for the global north. The person who's joined Bramble to lead the advisory work is a BCG partner who was head of the food systems program in Africa. And we're talking to him about it, two things. One thing that's much more similar, I thought, and the other things are different. The thing that is similar is they have all of the same problems with soil and fertility and overuse of chemicals and increased price of chemicals. And regen is very much a part of the conversation in agriculture in Africa, which I just hadn't realized at all. The thing that is different and weird is that you have these parallel states. So they are being employed both by governments, but in many of these countries that they're working in, the big foundations, so Gates and Bezos, employ more people than the government in their areas. So you've got this very interesting, slightly weird question about whose responsibility it is to solve it. And I don't know what the answer to this is, but it's just a very straight, like you've basically got two governments, or two people have the power and the money spending in government, in some cases the NGOs and more. So I think it is
similar but different. The second question was on... Sorry, better answer here. And the fertilizer companies are very... Third, more embedded fertilizer companies with the governments. Yes, I think that's, yeah, interesting. I didn't say that, he did. The second question was here. Andy, do you remember what that one was?
I do. Yeah. Well, I remember the question that was to me.
Do that one.
When I was farming in France, and we had a very small farm mill and bakery, and what I really noticed was that when we were getting going with that, there's quite an advanced sort of organic movement in France, certainly there was at the time, and there were whole aisles of the supermarket in the local Carrefour suddenly went organic. And that was incredibly helpful to me on my little farm, getting people interested in what I was doing. So I'm very much of the opinion that people who broadly want the same thing need to make sure that we collaborate, even if we're going about things in different ways. So I would say that if you've got a local triangle going and we've decided to take a risky path and get investment and try and build a brand and try and reconnect with people and shout this message from the rooftops, then these two things are entirely complementary, and maybe you don't need to do the same thing, or maybe you want to, you know, but fundamentally I just think it's so important. We live in a world where a dead tree is worth more than a live tree, where Ozempic, the weight loss drug, the company that owns that has got bigger GDP than Denmark, and where 90% of global grains are in the hands of 4 companies. So let's just make progress.
Great, and I'm going to have to answer your other question afterwards. I'm so sorry, I'll see you in the bar. Ben, to your question, the one thing I wish I'd gone well, actually 2 things. One thing we didn't put in was, it sounds so banal, but I think it's really important, 50-50 pasta, half whole grain, half white, is really delicious. Whole grain pasta is disgusting. And it is almost impossible to get hold of, sorry to everyone I've offended. It's almost impossible to get hold of 50-50 pasta in the UK. Singapore have made 50-50 noodles the norm. That is what you buy, and I wish that I was going to persuade the supermarkets to make that campaign. I didn't. The other, because fibre is like the biggest thing that we're all missing. To the lady down here. And the second thing is I wish I'd gone much stronger on what we rather lamely call community eat well, but the Alexander Rose charity has proven that literally if you give people fruit and veg vouchers who are living in poverty, for the local market, they buy more fruit and veg, they sleep better, their children go from eating 7% 5 a day to 64%. It is the single simplest intervention, and we should be doing in a world with so much inequality, we should forget about the ideology and we should be doing that. So I wish I'd gone stronger on that. Andy, what would you wish I'd said?
Well, both of those things, because the fruit and veg one is a no-brainer as far as I can see, and then the whole meal one is great. Like for what we're trying to do, trying to pay farmers a premium and yet make affordable food for as many people as we possibly can, the less we lose in milling, the better it is, not just for us as people, but for the economics of the whole thing. If you're losing 30% in extraction, your cost difference at the beginning just got a lot bigger.
Yeah.
You know?
There's where all your brand could go.
So let's bring the brand back.
Yeah. Yeah. So we're going to do 3 more 1-sentence questions and 1-sentence answers from Andy. So one here. We're going to answer the questions as we ask them.
Hi, Hugh Addison. I'm a farmer's son from Cumbria. How do you encourage the next generation to actually go into this? Because farming isn't an awfully attractive industry right now, particularly coming from a conventional stage. So what would you do to actually encourage people to make that jump?
I would say that if farmers were working in an environment where they were able to grow nutrient-dense food in nature-rich landscapes, like who doesn't want to do that? It's the best job in the world. So let's create a situation where that can happen.
One here.
Hi. We were talking about sort of timeframes of 10 years, and just wanted to share the leading science around the AMOC system.
In 1 sentence, not going to do a big science sherry thing.
I suppose I'm jumping forward towards a much more disrupted society,
yeah,
and the rise of far-right politics in Europe and in this country, and the extent to which you have thoughts around how we can address that, if that's not what we want in our society's health.
I have strong thoughts about that, which is I think we're going to see over the next 10 years as the biodiversity crisis and the climate crisis require more intervention, a coalescing of what at the moment are quite disparate forces acting to stop that. And I think we're in for a big fight on that. And I think we have to be ready for it, and we have to not assume that that will always be people who can be cast as nutters or nuts or whatever. So I think there is a huge political fight ahead that we need to be ready for.
Lovely put. Yeah.
You can answer the last question. The last question, which is...
Here.
Here.
Yeah. Hi. So land use framework was identified in the Labour manifesto. How do we ensure that food production remains a priority in that land use framework? Because land use is under increasing pressure for 101 things.
Yep.
How do we ensure food production is key?
I think they have to maintain the target of 60% of our own production here in the UK. And if the ELMS we deviate that massively, then we have to rethink it. That's my view, is you have to have that target, and that's really important. And then that's where you start.
Yeah.
Andy, do you have any motivational last words?
Yeah.
I'd like Andy Cato. Yeah. Do you want to say something?
Oh, I'm full of motivational last words. No, but I just think it's. I think we should give a shout out to the Cherry family, because what a remarkable coming together all of this is.
Yeah. Absolutely extraordinary. Andy Cato. Thank you.